We begin on that talk of cooperation between the Liberals and the Conservatives. And according to new reporting from CBC News, the two parties are working out behind-the-scenes deals on certain legislation. And these deals could provide a path to keep the government in power and avoid a federal election. I'm joined now by the reporter who broke this story. That is the CBC's Kate McKenna. So, Kate, good work, good reporting on this. What do we know about this deal-making happening behind the scenes?
Well, I'm told by sources, both Liberal and Conservative sources, that behind the scenes there's a much more cooperative tone. There's a much more of an effort to sort of work together and break the parliamentary gridlock that we began to see at the end of last year. And we can look back to the meeting that was held last week. The Prime Minister called for a meeting with Pierre Poilievre about a half hour last Wednesday, and both sides left the meeting saying that they were committed to working together. But we have a few more details about what was actually discussed at that meeting, some specifics in regards to getting some bills passed through the House of Commons and some concessions for the opposition, because, of course, the opposition's not always happy with all of the elements in all of the bills, including kind of the key bill, which is the Budget Implementation Act. So this is a large bill. It's more than 600 pages long. And it's something that was tabled last fall. It's likely to be a confidence vote when it comes back to the House of Commons. It's currently at committee stage. The Liberals, I know from conversations leading up to this House of Commons sitting, were concerned that there was no natural dance partner to get that bill through. But I'm told that in that kind of preliminary conversation between the Prime Minister and Mr. Poilievre, that there was an openness to amendments, and that amendments are still being talked about there. And what was described as the early phases of amendments on that one particular segment that was flagged to me that the Conservatives will likely seek to remove is a segment that would allow a cabinet minister to exempt some corporations from laws. That's something they take issue with. But there were other things as well, C8, which is a telecommunications bill, and of course C9, which is an anti-hate bill that was a subject of filibuster and a lot of Conservative anger last fall because they claim, and some religious groups claim, that it would inadvertently sort of criminalize some forms of worship. I'm told that that's a red line. But following this meeting with the Prime Minister, there is a path forward, I'm told, from both sides of the aisle, and that they are working sort of collaboratively to try and get this done.
Okay, the Budget Implementation Act, the name doesn't leave much to the imagination. It is implementing the measures in the budget, but often things are tacked on, like this issue about giving ministers the ability to exempt corporations from certain responsibilities. Clearly, the government would like its agenda to pass, and clearly the opposition would like to avoid an election, given where public opinion is. So there is an incentive to cooperate on both sides here, right?
Absolutely.
This is what's driving this?
And we heard what was possibly the beginning of kind of a narrative from the Liberals, like, oh, if the Conservatives are constantly obstructing, then we will have to go to an election. We're still hearing that a little bit, but we heard from the House Leader last week, Steve McKenna, that he'd like to see this era of cooperation continue. For the Conservatives, Pierre Poilievre is coming back from his leadership review with, resounding support from his party, 87.4%. But there was an election less than 12 months ago. They cost a lot of money. We know from polling that some polls show that the Conservatives and the Liberals are neck and neck, but Mr. Carney's personal popularity continues to be significantly higher than Mr. Poilievre's at this time. So they're aware of that. They are aspiring to get some concessions, that they can go to their base and say, look, we know, we're not taking the government down, but look, we held them to account. We're doing what the opposition is supposed to do. And we know that the Conservatives are quite seized right now with trying to look more prime ministerial, trying to show that they're willing to work with the Liberals, that they're not just going to be obstructionist at every possible opportunity. And so these are all things that are serving their narrative while also keeping the government in power. Okay,
it's interesting. Prime Minister Carney willing to give on his Budget Implementation Act, and maybe the Conservatives allowing a budget that puts an $80 billion deficit on the books to go through Parliament. Kate McKenna, good reporting. We appreciate that. CBC's Kate McKenna here in Ottawa. Well, look, the parliamentary committees, they'll give us a clear sign of whether these promises of cooperation have real traction, especially the Justice Committee, where, as Kate just mentioned, there has been a standoff over legislation to amend the criminal code to make it easier to prosecute hate speech. Now, the Bloc wants to remove religious exemptions that protect against prosecution. The Conservatives argue this would criminalize religious texts and scripture. So normally when a committee studying contentious legislation cancels a meeting, it's a bad sign, but in this case, it might be a sign of progress. We've got James Maloney here. He is the Liberal Caucus Chair and the Chair of the Justice Committee. James Maloney, good to see you again, sir.
Thanks for having me on, David.
I will say that we reached out to you to come on to talk about this before we knew about Kate's reporting, so it was a little bit of a surprise to us. But let's start with the Justice Committee. This cancellation, is that a sign of a problem or is that a sign of a progress? Because you're supposed to meet today to go over this bill.
No, in fact, it's not a problem at all. It's a sign of a solution, in my opinion. Look, we were scheduled to meet at 11 o'clock this morning, and shortly before the meeting was about to begin, there had been some conversations going on that led me to the conclusion that it was in the best interest of this piece of legislation and the best interest of having the committee function properly to cancel the meeting in the hopes that those conversations can continue. Look, I mean, David, what we're talking, I'm here as the chair of the committee, but I'm also a member of the Liberal government.
Right.
This is an important piece of legislation, as Kate just talked about. You mentioned it, of course. And Canadians need this bill passed. I mean, this anti-hate legislation is incredibly important. Nobody will disagree with that. Religious groups, MPs, and people from all parties. So it's in the best interest of everybody, in particular Canadians, to take a pause and see if we can find a path forward and get through it.
Okay, so who is doing the negotiations right now? Because as chair of the committee, you have a neutral role to arbitrate things, so you wouldn't necessarily be there at the table with this. But the Bloc has a pretty clear demand, right, on removing the religious exemption because they feel people have engaged in hate speech under the guise of expressing their faith, and the Conservatives worry about it being weaponized against, people with strongly held religious beliefs. So, is it the Bloc, the Conservatives, and the Liberals who are negotiating? Is it the House leaders? Where is this conversation?
Well, you're quite right. Look, in my capacity as chair, I'm not involved in those negotiations. My job is to make sure that the meetings function properly, and I'm neutral, and I think everybody in the committee would agree with that. But the conversation's happening, I think at the House leader level and other levels to try to find this path forward. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of negative rhetoric, if I can put it that way, surrounding this bill. Kate talked about the spirit of cooperation. It's unfortunate because I wish Canadians could see what goes on when the cameras are not on, as opposed to when they are on, because things tend to get sensationalized and blown up. Religious freedom is a fundamental principle in Canada, always has been and always will be. I don't know where the bill's going to end up and what provisions are going to be amended and which are going to be added. That's up to the committee members to decide when we get back to work. These
are pretty fundamental disagreements, though, right? So it's going to take some give somewhere, right? Because, the Conservatives have been arguing that this could lead to the prosecution of people for quoting scripture and certain religious texts. So do you think this can be hammered out by Wednesday when you meet next? Because, as you say, the protection of people from hate speech is a key part of this that a lot of people want to see implemented.
Look, I hope it'll be worked out by Wednesday because I want to get back to work and I want to get this bill passed. Canadians want this bill passed. This bill contains a number of provisions. Look, if you look at this bill from a broader perspective, David, both parties want the protections that are in this new piece of legislation. Both parties have been asking for this type of legislation to be passed. Canadians, religious groups from all sorts have been asking for legislation like this. So we have to get through this impasse. I can assure you that when this bill is passed, and in the interim, that religious freedom is not in jeopardy in any way, shape, or form.
Just to go back to Kate's reporting on this larger conversation that is happening, obviously between the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition. I don't know if you were in that meeting with Mark Carney and Mr. Poilievre, but
I wish I was.
Well, what does this? It sounds like though there is going to be a sincere effort for compromise in both directions here. What's your sense of the appetite for a spring election in your caucus and in the broader Parliament?
Zero appetite. Look. I spent the weekend at home. When I go out for a walk with my dog, my neighbors stop me all the time. Not a single one of them said, James, I want an election, I want a lawn sign, or I'm going to vote you out. No, quite the opposite. People do not want an election. The public doesn't want one, and politicians don't want one. Unfortunately, some of the rhetoric gets amped up. And look, and I've said this to you and your colleagues before, without gossip and rumors, there would be about 80% less things to talk about on Parliament Hill. Nobody wants an election. You heard the Prime Minister at the opening of the show. Yep. He wants to get things done, and that's the priority, and that includes the Justice Committee, and that's why we took a pause today to make sure we could do that.
So when you look at these two things in sequence, just as a final point, that if there is meaningful work on breaking this logjam at the Justice Committee, and if Mr. Poilievre and Mr. Carney are having these sort of fruitful conversations on how to move things ahead, I mean, how do you view that? Do you think this Parliament will get to a point where things can function? Because the obvious political alliances aren't there like they were in the last minority parliament with Jagmeet Singh and Justin Trudeau, right? The dynamic is quite different, and the NDP aren't on committee. Look,
this is a true minority parliament, right? I mean, people make a lot about the fact that we're 2 or 3 seats now short of a majority, but the fact of the matter is, Canadians, we had an election. There's some big issues at play here. Canadians are expecting us to work on these issues and address them. People don't have time for the small p politicking of what goes on in Parliament Hill. So yeah, I'm optimistic that the parties can work together and find a path forward. I was interested in listening to Kate's story because, I should talk to her on background, see what she can tell me, perhaps. But look, I honestly believe, and when I have conversations with opposition members on the Justice Committee or in the House of Commons or out in the corridors, people want to get things done. Yeah. And that's the bottom line, and that's what Canadians are expecting, including this very important piece of legislation, C9, because the hate crimes in Canada have increased in the last number of years. People need to be free to go to church, to their mosque, to their synagogue without fear of anybody getting their way or stopping them from practicing their own religion. And that's what's going to happen.
James Maloney, Chair of the Justice Committee and Chair of the Liberal Caucus. We much appreciate the time. Thanks for coming in.
Anytime, David. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Prime Minister. Is it time for a spring election?
It's time to do a lot more work. We've got a lot of work to do.
Prime Minister Mark Carney says it's time to get to work as he faces questions about a spring election from our Chris Rands there. It comes as the Globe and Mail reports that Carney and Ontario Premier Doug Ford discussed a snap election casually in order to secure a majority. Well, CBC News has also learned that Liberals and Conservatives are working out a path that could keep the government in power and keep this minority parliament running for a bit longer. We're going to start there with the power panel. We've got Supriya Dwivedi, who is an advisor to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Brad Levine is a former national campaign director for the NDP. Rob Russo is the Canada correspondent for The Economist. And here with me in the studio is Kate Harrison. She is a conservative political analyst. So, Kate, I want to start with you, if I can. The trade-off, or the discussions about a trade-off that's happening with coming out of the meeting with the Prime Minister and Pierre Poilievre, maybe changes to the Budget Implementation Act to keep things going. Is this suddenly there is alignment between the two parties, or do the Conservatives really not want to give the Liberals an excuse to have an election?
Well, I don't think anybody wants an election. You heard James Maloney say that in the earlier interview, and really, what would we be having an election about? The very last election was about, the path forward to deal with Donald Trump, in addition to cost of living issues, neither of which the Liberals have made, I would say, meaningful progress on. So going to test voters on a ballot question that we just litigated back in the spring, I'm not sure that the government would necessarily get the result that they're hoping for out of that. I do think that it's going to be difficult for the government, if they change their mind, to pull the plug against a backdrop of Conservatives saying, we're willing to work with you to advance the needle. It's not just on the budget implementation bill. It's on the grocery rebate. You saw it even back in the fall around some of the major projects legislation. So Conservatives are, where appropriate, I think, willing to work with the government to try and make Parliament work at a time of instability. So the questions about when to go or not go, I think, are really in the government's court.
So Priya, how do you see this? Because there may be some bits of the Budget Implementation Act that the Prime Minister and others may be willing to compromise on, but the Conservatives will be paving a way for a budget that has a deficit of like $80 billion and maybe growing, which, as we know from Mr. Poilievre, is a problem. I mean, how does this look politically for them on this compromise?
I mean, I think I agree largely with Kate, which is that I think Canadians, the vast majority of Canadians want to see politicians working together to get stuff done. So quite frankly, I think it's smart for both the Conservatives and the Liberals to work together to get, pieces of legislation passed or to get parts of the budget passed and to work forward through this. Now, of course, the more cynical part of me needs to point out that if recent polls are indeed correct, then it would be terrible for the Conservatives to go to the polls right now, right? Because an election would likely yield a Liberal majority government. But of course, the usual caveats here apply, right? Campaigns matter, and the only poll that matters is on election day. So I'd come back to my first point in agreeing with Kate, which is they would have to make the case, something else would have to happen in order for the Liberals to look as though they were going to the polls for good reason, because otherwise, if they can't justify the main question, which will be, okay, so then why are we going to an election? I don't think voters would take too kindly to that, particularly not right now. And, it's very possible that the ballot question can shift. It can still be Trump related or America related, but some new threat or some new thing has emerged. And then I think that changes the game. But I would think I would largely agree with right now. I think it's smart for both parties to work to make Parliament better.
Brad, I was speaking with a senior player in the Liberal election machine from the last election, and they said that, unless the Conservatives started acting like Tea Party Republicans, it would be tough to justify having an election, right? As in committees simply weren't functioning. And certainly what we're seeing today, it sounds like that is not even a remote possibility if all the compromise talk is indeed sincere.
Yeah, I think there's two reasons why an incumbent minority government can go to the polls prematurely. One, they can say, I want a mandate. And two, they can say, Parliament's not working. Please help us fix this. On the first one, we want a mandate. Well, listen, we just had the last federal election last April. So it's been 9 months, approximately 9 months since the last election. So the interesting thing with Doug Ford's advice to Mark Carney, go early to get a mandate, Doug Ford, at that the time he pulled the trigger was just before Trump was coming in formally, or just at the same time. But he was already 33 months into his mandate, so it wasn't as it was further along than Mark Carney's.
But it was a majority, right?
He had a majority. He wanted a stronger. No, he wanted a stronger majority, and people did not penalize him for that. But he had 33 months into that term, whereas Carney's only got 9 months. Second one is Parliament's not working. This renewed sense of cooperation, I think, should signal to Canadians that there'll be no election in the near term, and two, that the Conservatives definitely don't want one. They don't want to hand, as Rob said last week, they don't want to hand Carney this notion that Parliament is paralyzed at a time of great economic economic challenges, as well as things like the sovereignty movements in Alberta and Quebec rearing their heads. So I think that the Canadians should be well assured that we've got quite a bit of time before the next federal election.
Okay, Rob, how do you view it?
Let the record show that on February 9th, 2026, this panel was in violent agreement.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how that
It's like one of those sports shows when they all pick the same team and the other team wins and it becomes a meme.
I think the lack of a pretext is really what hurts the Prime Minister and those pushing for an election. He won an election campaign and restored the Liberals, didn't restore them, but kept them in power when a lot of people thought that they were going to lose, because he said, I'm the guy to handle Trump. I'm the guy who can make a deal with Trump. He can't run on that this time. That can't be the pretext for this election unless Donald Trump signals in the next little while, in the next month or two, that he is going to withdraw from the Canada-US-Mexico Free Trade Agreement. And then the Prime Minister might have a pretext at that point. But I think what we're seeing is something that Stephen Harper kind of suggested last week, is that both parties need to put aside partisanship at this moment that we're in to try and get things done. And it'll be interesting to see if the Conservatives develop a more coherent position on Trump to keep this going. I think that's a really interesting development. I understand that it's driven by the prospects of a hanging in the morning, according to the polls as they stand right now. But I think it should be something that Canadians welcome, and it's probably good for the country at this time in our history.